because you put your faith in me and believe what I have told you, I count you as in compliance with everything that I require. Now, why does Paul bring this up now? He is saying basically it's the same with us. Same with the Galatians. You don't, see, it's not that Abraham did something and God said, wow, you are really righteous. It's because God told him something. He gave him a message and Abraham believed it. And it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now, this word righteousness, the way we ordinarily think of it, I think many times, is not in the sense of something that's imputed or accounted, but something that has to do with our behavior or our life, and that is in there as well. But I like what the Message translation does with this verse, and I'd like to show you what the Message says when it translates this verse. Don't these things happen among you just as they happened with Abraham? Now listen to what he says here. I think this is very good, this translation. He believed God, and that act of belief was turned into a life that was right with God. Now that's an excellent translation of the thought here. See, because it's not just saying that God imputed to Abraham righteousness and then go your merry way and forget about God. Now you're righteous, just go on. No, his act of believing God, God used that to transform his life into a life that was pleasing to God. Now what we tend to think is we have to do that. But you see, the reason it's important to understand this word righteousness is because if you get a grasp of what Paul is saying in these verses here, you won't then try to do what Jesus has already done. Now, if I could paraphrase all those verses that we led up to this, I could say, hi, Donna, how are you?
Hi.
Good to see you. I could say it means this. Paul came and preached to the Galatians about Jesus, and then they forgot about Jesus and set out to do for themselves what Jesus had already done for them. What is it that Jesus had already done for them and for us? He made us right in the eyes of God. Now, this also adds the thought that Abraham, as an example, it said his act of belief was turned into a life that was right with God. And I think that's a good thought. And so that's what I want to talk about today, not all those earlier things. That was just preliminary. How is it that belief or faith can be turned into a life that is the right kind of life? What we generally think is, well, I've got to buckle down now and be serious. Now I'm a Christian, I better get straight. Well, no, now that you're a Christian, you just need to keep your faith in God, and he makes you. Paul goes to great pains in his epistles. I shouldn't say pain, that's a bad expression. He goes to he makes a point of telling us that we are who we are in the eyes of God by God's own act. Here's how he says it in Ephesians. Ephesians 2:8 says, by grace you're saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God. Not of works, lest any man should boast. Then the very next verse, in verse 10, says, for we are his workmanship. You see how he emphasizes that. It says, who we are in the eyes of God, we are who we are because he made us that. We are his workmanship, created. That involves a creator, created in Christ Jesus for good works. You see, the life, he's saying the same thing there in Ephesians 2:10. The life of good works results from an act of creation and him making us that way. Another very familiar passage that we quote all the time, at least I do anyway, and we sing songs about it, 2 Corinthians 5:17. If any man be in Christ, he is a new creation. Whenever you see the word creation, you know there's a creator behind it. And and this is all secondary to the thought. When you look around at this physical creation, you ought to say, I see this physical creation, there must be a creator somewhere. I saw a book. I'm always interested in, I read, I've got a Kindle. You know what Kindle is, these electronic book readers. And so whenever I get a book on Kindle, they always, you know how they are, they're good at advertising. They always say, other people who bought this also bought, and they show me. And so I look at those, and I saw a book written by a scientist who made the observation that for us to live on this planet, for this planet to be, everything had to be just exactly perfect. It had to be the exact distance from the sun that it is. If it were a little further, we'd all freeze and die. If it were a little closer, we'd all burn up and die. If the earth weren't spinning at the rate that it spins, if it weren't on the axis that it were. And he said you could look at the whole of the physical creation that supports life here and reduce it to a set of numbers that if they were any different, we would all die. Life couldn't exist. And the name of his book is just 6 numbers. That's what he calls 6 numbers, because he has these different numbers that describe different aspects of the scientific world. Well, you see, that was God's original creation, and anybody with an honest mind, I think, would look around and say, look at how this world functions. This couldn't have just happened by random chance, you know. Another way of explaining that, by the way, this is all free, no charge for this. I saw another book, a man explaining this. He starts his book off this way, and he said, could you make a spider, not just a picture of one, and not even a row, an actual, could you make one? And you'd somewhere go, no, of course not. Well, what if I gave you millions of years? Could you make one? Well, no. What if I gave you 20 million years? Could you make a spider? And I guess the answer would be, well, you could give me all the time in the world, and I still couldn't make a spider. Or if you, with all of your smarts and given millions of years, if you don't think you could build a spider and make it live, what makes you think that by random chance a spider could, life could just somebody pop into life? When you see life and its complexity, you know that there's a creator behind it. You ought to look at and see that way. Just like if you saw a machine built with all these buttons and dials and gears, you wouldn't think, wow, this thing just appeared here. No, somebody made it, right? So, what are we talking about? Well, the new creation, that's the first creation is this outward world. The new creation is what he does on the inside of us when we believe the gospel. He creates a new life in us. Now, what Paul is upset with the Galatians about is, having entered into this life, this Christian life through faith in Christ, they then turned around and thought they could create a life that's pleasing to God through their own efforts and their own works, whereas Jesus had already put them in that position. They were turning, in a sense, from Christ. In Galatians, Paul, he really gets upset with it. Elliot, if you go back to Galatians a minute, in chapter 5, look at what he says here. This is just a side thought, and I'm going to go back to Abraham in a minute. He says, verse 1, chapter 5, verse 1. This is how he's summing up this argument with them. He says, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Now, lest you get the wrong idea, it's not talking about sin as the yoke of bondage. He's talking about the Old Testament law, and you can find that out from reading the previous chapter. If you read the end of chapter 4, he points out that Abraham had two wives. One was free and one was the bondwoman, Hagar. And they both had children. One was born by promise, by supernatural promise. That was Isaac. That was God's plan. But the other came by human means, by natural means. That was the bondwoman. And so he's saying those are like two covenants. Like the old covenant that's all about you and your work, or the new covenant, it's all about Jesus and his work. So he says, stand fast in the liberty. In other words, you're free from having to do anything to put yourself in right standing with God. Behold, verse 2 says this, I, Paul, say to you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Now that's what the people who were preaching to mix the law with faith, they were saying, first of all, you need to be circumcised. Why? Because it's a requirement of the law. He says, if you're going to go that path, then you don't need Jesus. That's what he's saying. Could I paraphrase it that way? He says, if you're going to take that route, then what do you need a Savior for? If you're going to be right by conforming yourself to what you think God requires, you don't even need a Savior. Christ profits you nothing. Go ahead and do it then. But the truth of the matter is, there isn't anything, no amount of work and labor can do for you what Jesus has done that you can have by free grace. Therefore, I testify again, to every man that is circumcised, he's a debtor now to do the whole law. Christ has become of no effect to you. Whosoever of you is justified by the law. You're fallen from grace. Because I preach grace a lot, because I've been called a grace extremist. Well, I'm happy to have that badge. I am a grace extremist. I say it's all about Jesus, it's all about his grace. We do have a part to play, and one word defines it, faith. We're supposed to believe in that. Anyway, so people have said, I've had this question, don't you believe you can fall from grace? And usually what they mean by that is if you ever do anything wrong, the slightest infraction, if you ever commit a sin, you fall. No, that's not how you fall from grace. I always have to say, yes, it's in the Bible. Here, it's in this verse. This is the only place you can read about falling from grace. And you know how Paul says you fall from grace? By forgetting about Jesus and thinking, I'm going to do it myself. That's how, because you fall out of his work into your work. Yeah. So, that's how you fall from grace. Now, here's what I want to talk about, though. That's all background. That's all free. Extra, no charge for that. Here's what I want to talk about. How is it that, he said in the Message translation, that act of faith became a life that is pleasing to God? Well, let's go and read just a little more about Abraham, then I want to give you some illustrations, maybe make this point. Look in Romans chapter 4. Romans chapter 4 is a